Captain Marcus Taylor adjusted his sunglasses as he strolled into the bustling airport terminal. Today, he wasn't wearing his crisp pilot uniform or carrying his flight bag. Instead, he was dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, looking like any other passenger. This was a rare moment for him, a vacation he had worked hard to earn. He smiled, thinking about the warm beach and quiet escape waiting for him on the other side of this flight. As Marcus approached the first-class check-in counter, he presented his boarding pass and employee ID to the staff. The line was long, filled with travelers of all kinds, business people, families, and a few first-time flyers nervously clutching their passports. Marcus glanced around, feeling a little out of place without his usual pilot's attire. "Excuse me, sir," the gate agent called out, her tone polite but firm. "This line is for first-class passengers only." Marcus nodded, offering a friendly smile. "I know. I'm traveling on my employee benefit ticket. Here's my ID." The agent glanced at the ID briefly, then looked back at Marcus. Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a raised eyebrow. "You're an airline employee?" she asked, her voice skeptical. "Yes, I'm a pilot for this airline," Marcus replied patiently. He was used to surprising people, standing at 6 feet tall with a confident but approachable demeanor. Marcus didn't fit the outdated image some held of a typical airline captain. The agent hesitated, looking him up and down. "I'm sorry, sir, but this ID doesn't look right. Are you sure you belong in first class?" Marcus kept his tone calm, though a twinge of frustration bubbled beneath the surface. "It's a legitimate ticket. I've flown with this airline for over a decade." A man behind Marcus in line cleared his throat loudly, muttering under his breath, "Why's this guy holding us up?" Marcus turned slightly, giving the man an apologetic nod. "It'll just take a moment." The agent sighed, crossing her arms. "I think you'll need to step aside, sir. Economy boarding is that way." Marcus looked at her, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't want to create a scene, but he also wasn't about to let this slide so easily. "If there's an issue, I'd be happy to speak with a supervisor." Before the agent could respond, a woman standing nearby stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said loudly, addressing the line. "This man doesn't deserve to be treated like this. He's clearly just trying to board like the rest of us." The gate agent frowned but didn't respond immediately. A few other passengers glanced at Marcus, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. Marcus felt the heat rising in his chest, but forced himself to stay calm. Drawing attention wasn't his goal. Finally, the agent sighed and said, "Fine, but I'll have to check this with my supervisor before you take your seat." She handed Marcus his ticket with a pointed look. "For now, please wait in the economy line." Marcus nodded silently, taking the ticket and moving aside. He felt the eyes of the other passengers on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent. As he settled into the economy section, he glanced out the window, wondering how a simple vacation flight had already become this complicated. The flight was about to begin, but Marcus had no idea this journey was far from ordinary. Little did he know, fate had something far more unexpected in store. "You said." Marcus sat in his economy seat, trying to let go of the frustration from the boarding gate. The narrow chair was far from the comfort of the first-class seat he was entitled to, but he decided to let it slide for now. He closed his eyes, hoping to relax during the flight. After all, this was his vacation. No schedules, no deadlines, just peace and quiet. The cabin buzzed with the usual sounds of passengers settling in. Luggage bins clicked shut, children laughed, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Marcus glanced around, observing the mix of travelers. A young couple sitting across the aisle whispered excitedly about their honeymoon destination. Nearby, an elderly woman adjusted her blanket, already dozing off. It was an ordinary flight, or so it seemed. As the plane began to taxi, a flight attendant passed by, checking seatbelts and securing the cabin. She paused when she reached Marcus. Her eyes flicked to the ID badge clipped to his carry-on bag, a standard item for airline employees. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, leaning closer. "Are you with the airline?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, I'm one of the pilots." The attendant's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You're a pilot? Oh, I see. Traveling on a staff ticket." "That's right," Marcus replied. He could tell she wasn't expecting his answer, but her reaction was far kinder than the gate agent's earlier. "Well, welcome aboard," she said with a warm smile. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let me know." "Thank you," Marcus said, appreciating the gesture. As the flight got underway, Marcus tried to focus on his book, a light novel he'd picked up at the airport. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced up occasionally and noticed a few passengers sneaking glances at him. Some seemed curious, others skeptical. The memory of the gate agent's dismissive tone lingered in his mind. A sudden turbulence interrupted his thoughts. The plane rocked gently, prompting a few gasps from passengers. Marcus remained calm. It was a minor jolt, nothing unusual. However, the brief moment of unease seemed to heighten the tension in the cabin. Not long after, an announcement crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a bit of turbulence but should be clear shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Marcus listened intently, analyzing the captain's tone out of habit. It was steady and reassuring, but Marcus could hear the subtle hint of strain. He dismissed it, assuming it was just the captain's reaction to managing a full flight. Moments later, an elderly man a few rows ahead called for assistance. His voice was weak, almost inaudible. A flight attendant rushed to his side, quickly summoning help from her colleagues. Marcus watched as a small crowd gathered around the man. Whispers spread through the cabin like wildfire. Some passengers craned their necks, trying to get a better view, while others murmured in concern. The word medical emergency was whispered repeatedly. The flight attendants worked quickly, but it was clear they were under pressure. Marcus's instincts kicked in, though he knew this wasn't his area of expertise. Still, he couldn't help but feel the growing unease in the cabin. Something about the situation felt more serious than the crew was letting on. Marcus leaned back, his mind racing. This was supposed to be a simple flight, but already the journey was turning into something else entirely. He had no idea that his role on this plane was about to change dramatically. Marcus sat in the economy section, trying to relax. He leaned back, resting his head against the seat. The hum of the engines and the soft chatter of passengers filled the cabin. He pulled out a book from his bag, hoping to distract himself from the uncomfortable start to his trip. But the memory of the gate agent's dismissive tone lingered. He had tried to brush it off, but it wasn't easy. The flight had only been in the air for about an hour when the first sign of trouble appeared. A small jolt shook the plane. Passengers gasped, gripping their armrests as the turbulence passed. Marcus remained calm, glancing out the window to check the weather. It was nothing serious, just a normal bump caused by air currents, but the reaction from some passengers hinted at nervousness spreading through the cabin. Not long after, a voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered a bit of turbulence, but it should pass soon. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement was calm and professional, but Marcus picked up on something others might not have noticed, a slight strain in the captain's voice. It was subtle, but years of experience in the cockpit had taught him to recognize it. Still, he told himself there was no need to overthink it. Everything seemed under control. Then, a commotion broke out a few rows ahead of Marcus. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle, crouching beside an elderly man who appeared to be in distress. The man clutched his chest, his face pale, and his breathing was shallow. A woman, possibly his wife, was seated beside him, calling for help with a trembling voice. Passengers began murmuring among themselves, craning their necks to see what was happening. Marcus watched as two more flight attendants hurried over, one carrying an oxygen mask. They moved quickly but seemed flustered, unsure of what to do next. "Is there a doctor on board?" one of the attendants asked loudly, her voice filled with urgency. Passengers glanced around, but no one spoke up. The cabin grew tense, and the whispers turned into worried chatter. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should step in. He wasn't a doctor, but he understood emergencies. He had dealt with crises in the cockpit countless times and knew how to stay calm under pressure. The elderly man's condition seemed to worsen, and the flight attendants appeared increasingly overwhelmed. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "I'm a pilot with this airline. Is there anything I can do to help?" The flight attendants turned to him, their expressions a mix of surprise and relief. One of them stepped forward. "Are you really a pilot?" she asked. "Yes," Marcus replied, holding up his employee ID. "I may not be a doctor, but I've handled emergencies before. Let me help coordinate until we can get proper medical assistance." The attendant nodded, her earlier skepticism replaced with gratitude. "Please," she said, "we could use all the help we can get." Marcus knelt beside the elderly man, assessing the situation. He wasn't sure how this flight would end, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't just sit back and watch. Once again, it seemed fate had other plans for him. "You said." The cabin was tense, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing on everyone around him. The elderly man's breathing was shallow, and his wife clutched his hand, her eyes filled with fear. Passengers nearby sat frozen, unsure of what to do. The flight attendants, though trying their best, looked overwhelmed by the growing emergency. Marcus knelt beside the man, his calm demeanor already beginning to steady the situation. "Let's start with the basics," he said gently to the attendants. "Do you have a medical kit on board?" One of the attendants nodded quickly. "Yes, I'll grab it right away." She hurried off toward the galley, leaving Marcus with the other attendants and the anxious passengers watching closely. "Ma'am," Marcus said, turning to the elderly man's wife, "can you tell me what happened? Has he experienced anything like this before?" She hesitated, her voice trembling as she spoke. He has heart problems, but this has never happened on a flight before. He said he felt a tightness in his chest and couldn't catch his breath." Marcus nodded, his mind racing through the possibilities. He wasn't a doctor, but he knew that staying calm and organized was critical. "Thank you for telling me. We'll do everything we can to help him." The attendant returned with the medical kit, handing it to Marcus. He opened it carefully, pulling out an oxygen mask. "Let's give him some oxygen to help his breathing," Marcus instructed. The elderly man's wife helped Marcus gently place the mask over her husband's nose and mouth. The man's breathing began to stabilize slightly, and his color improved just a little. "There you go, sir," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Just take slow, deep breaths." Meanwhile, the lead flight attendant spoke into her communication device. "Captain, we have a passenger experiencing a medical emergency. Should we prepare for an emergency landing?" Marcus overheard the conversation and decided to step in. "If it's all right, I'd like to speak to the captain directly," he said. The attendant looked at him with a mix of hesitation and trust before handing over the device. "This is Marcus Taylor," he said into the communication device. "I'm one of your airline's pilots. I'm in economy, assisting with a medical emergency. The passenger seems stable for now, but I recommend we assess our closest landing options in case his condition worsens." There was a brief silence before the captain responded, his tone professional but surprised. "Understood, Captain Taylor. I'll contact air traffic control and keep you updated." As Marcus handed back the communication device, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere around him. Passengers who had been skeptical or indifferent earlier now watched him with respect and gratitude. The elderly man's wife reached for Marcus's hand, her voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. "You didn't have to do this, but you did. Thank you." Marcus gave her a reassuring smile. "It's no problem, ma'am. Just focus on him, and we'll get through this." As the flight continued, Marcus remained by the man's side, monitoring his condition and offering words of comfort. The flight attendants, now more confident with his support, worked quickly and efficiently. The cabin, though still tense, felt steadier. Marcus didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to do whatever it took to ensure the man's safety, and the safety of everyone on board. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would leave everyone stunned. The flight continued smoothly for a while, but the tension in the cabin hadn't completely faded. Marcus kept an eye on the elderly man, who seemed more stable thanks to the oxygen mask and a calm environment. The attendants had informed the captain about the situation, but Marcus knew that emergencies like this could change in an instant. The intercom crackled again. "This is your captain speaking. We've been advised of the medical situation on board. We are currently assessing the closest airports for a potential emergency landing. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Passengers exchanged nervous glances. The cabin was quiet now, the earlier chatter replaced by whispers and worried faces. Marcus could sense the rising anxiety, and he knew he needed to keep everyone calm. A single voice of reassurance could make all the difference. He turned to the man's wife and gently said, "You're doing great. Just keep holding his hand and talking to him. He needs to hear your voice." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so scared," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do if something happens to him." Marcus placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We're doing everything we can, and the captain is ready to land if needed. You're not alone in this." As the plane continued its journey, turbulence struck again, this time stronger than before. Passengers gripped their armrests, and a child began to cry a few rows back. Marcus instinctively braced himself, scanning the cabin to ensure nothing was out of order. The flight attendants quickly moved to calm the passengers, reassuring them that the turbulence was temporary. Marcus admired their professionalism under pressure. They had regained their confidence, working as a team to manage the situation. Just as things started to settle, Marcus noticed something alarming. The elderly man's breathing, which had improved earlier, seemed labored again. His chest rose and fell unevenly, and his face grew pale once more. Marcus's heart raced. This wasn't a good sign. "We need to act now," Marcus told the flight attendants. "Contact the captain again and let him know the passenger's condition is worsening. We can't wait any longer." The lead flight attendant relayed the message immediately, her voice steady despite the urgency. Within minutes, the captain announced over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have decided to make an emergency landing. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Some passengers murmured nervously, while others visibly relaxed, glad to know help would be coming soon. Marcus focused on the elderly man, adjusting his oxygen mask and speaking calmly to him. "You're doing great," Marcus said softly. "Just hang in there a little longer. Help is waiting for you on the ground." The man opened his eyes briefly, giving Marcus a weak but grateful look. It was enough to keep Marcus going. As the plane began its descent, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He wasn't the one flying the plane, but in this moment, he was part of the team keeping this passenger and the rest of the cabin safe. The runway came into view through the small windows, and the cabin grew silent. Marcus prepared himself for what came next, knowing that even after the plane touched down, the journey was far from over. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane began its descent. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly at the nearest airport to ensure our passenger receives the medical attention they need. Please remain seated and prepare for landing." Passengers whispered anxiously, the tension in the air growing thick. Marcus remained calm, kneeling beside the elderly man who was now struggling to stay conscious. His wife held his hand tightly, her face pale with worry. The flight attendants moved swiftly, checking seatbelts and securing the cabin for landing. Marcus looked up and addressed the nearby passengers. Everything is under control. We're landing soon, and medical help will be waiting. Let's all stay calm and support each other. His reassuring words seemed to help. Some passengers nodded, others took deep breaths, and the whispers began to fade. The focus shifted to the elderly man, who was now the center of everyone's concern. The turbulence made the descent bumpy, but Marcus trusted the captain's skills. He knew firsthand the challenges of landing in less than ideal conditions, and he admired the smooth way the plane handled the approach despite the weather. Marcus glanced at the flight attendant nearest to him. "Is the medical team on standby?" "Yes," she confirmed. The captain radioed ahead. "An ambulance will meet us as soon as we land." "Good," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Let's make sure they get to him quickly." As the plane descended further, the tension in the cabin was almost unbearable. The elderly man's breathing remained shallow, and his wife's eyes were filled with tears. Marcus stayed by their side, adjusting the oxygen mask and offering quiet words of encouragement. "You're almost there, sir," Marcus said softly. "Just hold on a little longer." The wheels touched down with a thud, and the passengers let out a collective sigh of relief. The plane slowed to a halt on the runway, and the cabin filled with the sound of seat belts clicking open as people prepared to stand. The flight attendants quickly stepped in, reminding everyone to remain seated so the medical team could board. Through the window, Marcus saw flashing lights as an ambulance raced toward the plane. Within moments, paramedics entered the cabin, their equipment in hand. The lead flight attendant guided them to the elderly man, and Marcus stepped back to give them space. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking the man's vitals and carefully transferring him to a stretcher. His wife followed closely, clutching her husband's belongings. She paused for a moment, turning to Marcus with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "You stayed with us when we needed it most. I'll never forget what you did." Marcus gave her a reassuring nod. "I'm glad I could help. He's in good hands now." As the paramedics exited the plane with the man, the passengers began to clap. The sound was unexpected but heartfelt, a gesture of gratitude not just for the medical team but for Marcus as well. He nodded humbly, feeling a mix of relief and pride. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Thank you all for your patience and cooperation. We will be resuming our journey shortly." Marcus returned to his seat in economy, feeling the weight of the past hours. He hadn't planned for this flight to be anything but routine, but life had a way of surprising him. Little did he know, the impact of his actions today was far from over. As the paramedics wheeled the elderly man off the plane, a quiet calm settled over the cabin. Passengers stayed seated, respecting the crew's instructions, but their faces were filled with relief and curiosity. Marcus sat back in his economy seat, feeling a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. He had done what he could, and the man was now in capable hands. A flight attendant approached Marcus with a grateful smile. "Captain Taylor," she said softly, "thank you for everything. You really stepped up when we needed help." Marcus gave her a small nod. "I'm just glad I could assist. You all did a great job too. Emergencies like this aren't easy." The attendant looked around the cabin, noticing how many passengers were glancing in Marcus's direction. "You should know," she added, lowering her voice, "a lot of people here are talking about you. They're impressed." Marcus chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "I wasn't trying to make an impression. I just did what I could." The crew began preparing the plane to resume its journey. The captain made another announcement, thanking everyone for their cooperation and patience. As the plane taxied back to the runway, Marcus noticed a woman seated across the aisle leaning toward him. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I just wanted to say thank you. It was amazing to see how calm and focused you were. We could all see how much you cared." Marcus smiled, feeling a bit embarrassed by the attention. "I appreciate that. It's part of the job. You learn to stay calm in high-pressure situations." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Still," Not everyone would step in like you did. You didn't hesitate. That says a lot about who you are. Other passengers began to chime in, sharing their gratitude and admiration. A man a few rows back said loudly, "Hey, you're the pilot who had to sit in economy, right? We all saw what happened at the gate. That makes what you did even more impressive." Marcus shrugged modestly. "I'm just happy the passenger is getting the care he needs. That's what matters." The murmurs of appreciation continued as the plane took off again. People leaned over seats to get a better look at Marcus, their curiosity turning into respect. Some even started clapping again, a gesture that made Marcus feel both humbled and a little overwhelmed. The flight attendants, noticing the growing admiration for Marcus, decided to act. One of them approached with a warm smile. "Captain Taylor, would you mind coming to the front of the cabin for a moment?" Marcus hesitated, unsure of what to expect, but he nodded and followed her. She led him to the first-class section, where the passengers were waiting with applause. The lead flight attendant stepped forward and said, "On behalf of the crew and passengers, we want to thank you for your quick thinking and leadership today." Marcus smiled, feeling the genuine appreciation in the room. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's an honor to be part of this team, even as a passenger." As Marcus returned to his seat, he realized the journey wasn't just about helping one man. It had become a moment that reminded everyone on board of the power of compassion, calmness, and stepping up when it matters most. What had started as a rocky flight was now turning into a memory none of them would forget. The flight was back on course, and the passengers had settled into a calmer rhythm. However, the atmosphere in the cabin was different now. There was a sense of connection among everyone, a shared experience that had brought them closer. Marcus, sitting in his economy seat, couldn't help but reflect on how the day had unfolded. He had boarded the plane hoping for a quiet journey, only to face skepticism, unexpected challenges, and now, heartfelt recognition. It was humbling, but he wasn't the kind of person to let praise go to his head. As the plane cruised at a steady altitude, another passenger approached Marcus. It was the woman who had defended him earlier at the gate. She smiled warmly, leaning slightly over the seat in front of him. "I just wanted to say," she began, "you handled everything with so much grace. The way you stayed calm and stepped up when that man needed help, it was inspiring." Marcus smiled back. "Thank you. I didn't plan for any of this, but when someone needs help, you do what you can." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I saw how they treated you at the gate. It wasn't right. But the way you handled yourself, without anger or confrontation, says a lot about your character." Marcus appreciated her words but shifted the focus. "I think we all have moments where we can choose how to respond. Today just happened to be one of mine." The woman looked around at the other passengers. "Well, I hope they're all paying attention. We need more people like you." Marcus nodded, but his attention was drawn to the lead flight attendant, who was walking down the aisle toward him. She stopped at his row and smiled. "Captain Taylor," she said, her tone respectful, "the captain asked me to deliver a message. He says he's honored to have you as part of the team, and that your actions today were above and beyond." Marcus was taken aback by the kind words. "That means a lot. Thank you." The flight attendant continued. "Also, we've saved you a seat in first class for the rest of the flight. It's the least we can do after everything you've done." Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to make a scene, but the gesture was genuine, and he could tell the crew truly appreciated his efforts. Finally, he stood, giving a small nod to the passengers around him before following the attendant to the front of the plane. As he settled into the wide, comfortable seat, he couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. The first-class treatment he was denied earlier had come full circle, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it through his actions. The rest of the flight passed smoothly. Passengers occasionally glanced at Marcus with admiration, and some even stopped by to thank him personally as they stretched their legs. The crew treated him like a guest of honor, offering him refreshments and thanking him repeatedly. Marcus remained humble, grateful for the kindness, but focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't about recognition. It was about doing the right thing, no matter the circumstances. It was a reminder that dignity and compassion could break down even the strongest walls of prejudice. As the plane neared its destination, Marcus looked out the window at the clouds below, feeling a deep sense of peace. This flight had tested him in unexpected ways, but it had also reaffirmed his belief in the strength of humanity. Little did he know, his actions today would ripple far beyond this single journey. As the plane began its final descent, Marcus leaned back in his first-class seat, reflecting on the unexpected journey that had unfolded. The day had started with frustration, but it had turned into something far more meaningful. He hadn't set out to make a difference, yet somehow he had. The flight landed smoothly, and the passengers applauded. A mix of relief and gratitude for a journey that had brought them all together in an unusual way. Marcus remained seated as the cabin door opened, watching as people began to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark. The lead flight attendant approached Marcus with a bright smile. "Captain Taylor, thank you again for everything you've done. The crew will never forget this flight." Marcus nodded humbly. "You all did an amazing job too. It was a team effort." As the passengers filed out, many stopped to thank Marcus personally. A middle-aged man shook his hand firmly. "You've shown us what true leadership looks like," he said. "We need more people like you in the world." A young girl, clutching her mother's hand, looked up at Marcus with wide eyes. "Are you really a pilot?" she asked shyly. Marcus knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "That's right," he said with a kind smile. "One day, you could be one too." The girl's face lit up, and her mother gave Marcus a grateful nod. It was a small moment, but one that warmed his heart. As Marcus finally stepped off the plane, he noticed a small group of airline staff waiting near the gate. Among them was the gate agent who had dismissed him earlier. Her expression was sheepish as she approached. "Captain Taylor," she began hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you earlier, and I regret how I handled the situation." Marcus looked at her, his face calm. "We all make mistakes," he said gently. "What matters is that we learn from them." She nodded, clearly moved by his graciousness. "Thank you for understanding. And thank you for what you did during the flight. You've inspired a lot of people today." Word of Marcus's actions had spread quickly. As he walked through the terminal, several passengers from the flight approached him to express their admiration. Others, who had heard about the emergency, watched him with curious and respectful glances. By the time Marcus left the airport, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. This day had tested his patience, his professionalism, and his character. Yet it had also reminded him of the power of staying calm under pressure and leading with kindness. The story didn't end there. A few days later, Marcus's actions were shared on social media by passengers who had been on the flight. Their posts quickly went viral, highlighting the way he had stepped up in a moment of need and treated everyone with respect, even after facing unfair treatment himself. The airline also took notice. Marcus received a formal letter of appreciation from the company's leadership, along with a commitment to improve their training to ensure fairness and respect for all employees and passengers. For Marcus, the recognition was secondary. What mattered most was the difference he had made, both for the elderly man and for everyone who had witnessed his actions. It was a reminder to himself and to others that dignity, grace, and compassion could change the course of any journey.